Hello, and welcome back to Myth Theorist. Today's story is about a serial killer, a predator who hunted women over the course of 2 decades, a killer who murdered multiple victims and evaded justice for 20 years. But it's also a story about a woman's final act of resistance. It's a story about how a victim, in her last moments of struggle, left evidence that would eventually identify her killer. It's a story about the power of forensic science. And it's a story about how DNA, microscopic biological evidence left under fingernails during a violent struggle, can eventually bring a serial killer to justice. In 1996, a woman named Caroline Morrison disappeared from the suburbs of Perth, Australia. She was 23 years old. She was a student. She was vibrant, intelligent, beloved by her family and friends. She disappeared on an evening in March 1996 after finishing her shift at a local cafe. She never made it home. The police investigation that followed was intensive, but unsuccessful. Caroline vanished without a trace. There were no eyewitnesses. There was no apparent motive. There were no suspects. Caroline became another missing person case, another unsolved disappearance, another family left with questions and no answers. But what investigators didn't know was that Caroline had left crucial evidence. During her struggle against her attacker, during the moment of her abduction, Caroline had scratched her killer's skin. Her fingernails contained the DNA of the man who murdered her. For 20 years, that DNA sat in a laboratory, preserved and stored but unable to be analyzed effectively. For 20 years, a serial killer walked free. But then, in 2016, DNA technology had advanced sufficiently to analyze the evidence that had been collected 2 decades earlier. And when that evidence was finally analyzed, it revealed a match, a perfect DNA match, to a man named Derek Sampson. Derek Sampson was arrested, interrogated, confronted with evidence that had been waiting 20 years to expose him, and he confessed. This is the story of Caroline Morrison, and the serial killer that her final act of resistance, her struggle, her scratch, her DNA, finally brought to justice 20 years after her death. Perth, Australia, in 1996, was a sprawling city with a dark secret lurking beneath its sunny suburban surface. The suburbs were beautiful, tree-lined streets, attractive homes, a sense of community and safety. It was the kind of place where families felt secure, where children played outside without fear, where young women could walk home from work without worrying about predators. But appearances were deceptive. In 1996, Perth had a growing problem with violent crime, gang activity, drug trafficking, sexual assault, murders. The suburbs where families thought they were safe were actually hunting grounds for predators. Caroline Morrison lived in one of these suburbs. She lived with her parents, Sandra and Robert Morrison. She was the youngest of 3 children. Her siblings, both older, had moved away for university and careers. Caroline was still at home, working part-time at a local cafe while attending university part-time. Caroline was intelligent, ambitious, and kind. She had dreams of becoming a social worker. She wanted to help disadvantaged people. She had a strong sense of social justice and community responsibility. Her friends described her as funny, caring, and someone who listened when others needed to talk. She was the kind of person that people gravitated toward, the kind of person who would be deeply missed. On March 27, 1996, a Wednesday evening, Caroline finished her shift at the cafe where she worked. She was scheduled to leave at 8 p.m. Around 8:15 p.m., she texted her mother, "Leaving work now, home in 20 minutes." The walk from the cafe to her home took approximately 15 minutes, depending on the exact route and walking pace. Caroline never arrived home. By 9 p.m., her mother Sandra was concerned. Caroline was always reliable. She always arrived home when she said she would. She always texted if she was running late. By 9:30 p.m., Sandra called the police and reported her daughter missing. Police arrived at the Morrison home around 10 p.m. They began the process of gathering information about Caroline, her last known location, her potential movements, possible suspects or threats. What police didn't know at the time was that Somewhere in the suburbs of Perth, Caroline Morrison was already dead. She had been abducted after leaving the cafe. She had been taken to a secluded location. She had been attacked, assaulted, and murdered. In the struggle that preceded her murder, Caroline had fought, she had resisted, and in that resistance, she had scratched her attacker's skin. Her fingernails contained the DNA of her killer, but Caroline's killer would remain unknown for 20 years. The police investigation into Caroline Morrison's disappearance launched immediately. By late Wednesday evening, police had begun interviewing friends, family, and co-workers. They were trying to establish a timeline of Caroline's movements. They were trying to identify potential suspects. By early Thursday morning, search teams were mobilized. The cafe where Caroline worked was searched. The route from the cafe to her home was searched. Nearby parks and public spaces were searched. Nothing was found. By Thursday afternoon, police suspected foul play. A 23-year-old woman doesn't simply disappear without explanation. The most likely scenario was abduction, assault, possibly murder. Police issued a missing person alert. Caroline's photograph was distributed to the media. Television stations broadcast her image. Newspapers printed her story. Missing woman. Have you seen Caroline Morrison? Police received tips. Many tips. Most were useless. Some required investigation. None led to Caroline. By Friday, 3 days after Caroline's disappearance, police were facing a frustrating reality. They had no leads, no suspects, no evidence, no direction for investigation. Police widened their search area. They searched forests and bushland surrounding Perth. They searched bodies of water. They dredged ponds. They found nothing. Days became weeks. Weeks became months. By mid-1996, the investigation had stalled completely. Caroline's case was transferred to the cold case file. It remained officially open, but the intensive investigation phase had ended. Caroline's parents, Sandra and Robert, were devastated. Their youngest daughter, their cherished child, had vanished, and police had no answers. They gave interviews to the media. They pleaded for information. They offered a reward for any information leading to Caroline's discovery. Nothing came forward. The psychological impact on Sandra and Robert was profound. They lived with uncertainty, not knowing if their daughter was alive or dead, not knowing what had happened to her, not knowing if her body would ever be found. Years passed. By 2000, Caroline's case was 4 years cold. By 2005, it was 9 years cold. By 2010, it was 14 years cold. Police occasionally reviewed the file, occasionally pursued a new lead, but nothing substantial emerged. Throughout the late 1990s and early 2000s, other young women disappeared from the Perth suburbs. Young women, students, working women, all between the ages of 20 and 30, all disappearing near the same geographic area, all suspected to be the work of the same predator. In 1998, a woman named Natasha Coleman disappeared. She was 22 years old. She was a student at a local university. In 2002, a woman named Jennifer Walsh disappeared. She was 26 years old. She worked as a nurse. In 2004, a woman named Michelle Parker disappeared. She was 24 years old. She was a shop assistant. Police began to suspect that these disappearances were connected, that a serial killer was hunting women in the Perth suburbs. But despite extensive investigation, police could not establish definitive connections. Different police jurisdictions didn't coordinate effectively. Case files weren't shared efficiently. And without conclusive evidence linking the cases, police couldn't officially declare that they were hunting a serial killer. The media, however, had no such restrictions. Newspapers began referring to the Hillside Stalker, a serial killer supposedly hunting women in the Perth suburbs. Public fear escalated. Young women were warned to avoid walking alone at night. Neighborhoods organized vigilante watch groups. Parents became hyper-vigilant about their daughters' safety, but the Hillside Stalker remained elusive. Years passed. The disappearances continued to be investigated, but no killer was identified. The cases remained cold. What investigators didn't know at the time was that crucial forensic evidence had been collected shortly after Caroline Morrison's disappearance. In the weeks following Caroline's disappearance, her body was eventually discovered by search teams in a secluded area of bushland outside Perth. The body was in an advanced state of decomposition, making it difficult to determine cause of death or gather evidence. However, investigators managed to collect evidence from Caroline's fingernails. They noticed scratches and biological material under her nails, evidence that suggested she had scratched her attacker during her struggle. This biological material was carefully collected and preserved. It was sent to a forensic laboratory in Perth. In 1996, DNA technology was primitive. The laboratory was able to extract DNA from the material under Caroline's fingernails, but the DNA profile was incomplete. Technology at the time wasn't sufficiently advanced to create a usable profile that could be compared to suspects, so the DNA evidence was stored, carefully preserved, in case future technology would allow for more sophisticated analysis. For 20 years, that evidence sat in storage. Police occasionally reviewed the evidence, hoping that technological advances might one day make it useful. But DNA technology advanced slowly, and the DNA from under Caroline's fingernails remained largely inaccessible. By 2016, DNA technology had advanced dramatically. What had been impossible in 1996 was now routine. DNA profiles could be extracted from biological material that was previously considered unusable. DNA databases had grown to include millions of profiles. DNA matching had become sophisticated and reliable. A detective named Stephen Chen, who was reviewing cold cases for the Perth Police Department, decided to revisit the Caroline Morrison investigation. Chen obtained the preserved DNA evidence that had been collected from Caroline's fingernails in 1996. He submitted the evidence to a modern DNA laboratory with current technology. The laboratory was able to extract and analyze the DNA. They were able to create a complete DNA profile from the biological material under Caroline's fingernails. They entered that profile into the National DNA Database, CODIS equivalent in Australia. The system searched. It compared the DNA profile against all known offenders in the database, and it found a match, perfect match, to a man named Derek Sampson. Derek Sampson had been arrested for an unrelated crime in 2005. His DNA had been entered into the database at that time. For 11 years, his DNA profile had sat in the database. For 11 years, his DNA matched the biological evidence from under Caroline Morrison's fingernails, but nobody had made the connection until Detective Chen submitted the 1996 evidence for reanalysis in 2016. Derek Sampson was arrested on March 15, 2016, exactly 20 years after Caroline Morrison's abduction and murder. Sampson was brought to the police station for interrogation. Detective Chen presented him with the DNA evidence. Chen explained that Sampson's DNA matched biological material found under the fingernails of Caroline Morrison, a woman who had disappeared in 1996. Initially, Sampson denied involvement. He claimed mistaken identity. He claimed the DNA match must be false. But confronted with the definitive DNA evidence, Sampson eventually confessed. He admitted to abducting Caroline Morrison on March 27, 1996. He admitted to taking her to a secluded location. He admitted to assaulting her and ultimately murdering her. He described Caroline's struggle. He described how she had scratched him during the attack. He provided specific details about what had happened during the murder. His confession matched the physical evidence. It matched the DNA evidence. It matched the circumstances of Caroline's disappearance. Detective Chen pressed Sampson about the other disappearances: Natasha Coleman, Jennifer Walsh, Michelle Parker. Sampson initially remained evasive, but eventually confessed to being responsible for those murders as well. He admitted to murdering 3 women over the course of several years. He admitted to being the hillside stalker that Perth had feared for nearly 2 decades. Derek Sampson was tried for the murder of Caroline Morrison in late 2016. The trial was straightforward. The DNA evidence was definitive. Sampson's confession was clear. There was no possibility of acquittal. The jury deliberated for less than a day. They returned a guilty verdict. Derek Sampson was convicted of the murder of Caroline Morrison. At sentencing, Caroline's parents addressed the court. Sandra Morrison, Caroline's mother, spoke about her daughter. She spoke about the agony of not knowing what had happened to Caroline for 20 years. She spoke about the moment when police finally called and said they had identified her daughter's killer. For 20 years, we lived in uncertainty, Sandra said, her voice steady but emotional. We didn't know if our daughter was alive or dead. We didn't know what had happened to her. We didn't know who had taken her away from us. Then, in 2016, technology gave us answers. DNA technology. Evidence that our daughter left, scratches she made during her struggle, finally revealed her killer. I wish this had happened in 1996, not 2016, but I'm grateful that justice finally came, even if it took 2 decades. Derek Sampson was sentenced to life in prison, without the possibility of parole for the murder of Caroline Morrison. Additional sentences were imposed for the murders of the other women. He will spend the rest of his life in prison. He will never be released. Following Derek Sampson's conviction for Caroline Morrison's murder, investigations were reopened into the disappearances of Natasha Coleman, Jennifer Walsh, and Michelle Parker. Using DNA evidence and forensic analysis, police were able to establish definitive connections between Sampson and the murders of all 3 women. Sampson's DNA was found in evidence collected from each victim. Additionally, Sampson confessed to all 3 murders, providing specific details about each crime that only the perpetrator could have known. In 2017, Derek Sampson was tried for the murders of Natasha Coleman, Jennifer Walsh, and Michelle Parker. He was convicted of all 3 murders. He received additional life sentences. For the families of Natasha Coleman, Jennifer Walsh, and Michelle Parker, the resolution brought closure. After years of uncertainty, they finally knew what had happened to their daughters. They finally knew who was responsible. Natasha Coleman's mother said, "For 18 years, we lived with not knowing. Now we know. It doesn't bring my daughter back, but at least we have answers. At least the man who murdered her is imprisoned." The case of Derek Sampson and Caroline Morrison demonstrates the critical importance of forensic evidence in solving crimes. Specifically, it demonstrates the power of DNA evidence left behind during violent struggles. When Caroline Morrison scratched her attacker during her abduction and murder, she was engaging in a natural human response to violence. She was fighting back. She was resisting. In doing so, she was unwittingly leaving crucial evidence, biological evidence, DNA evidence, evidence that would eventually identify her killer. That evidence sat unused for 20 years, not because police didn't recognize its value, but because technology was insufficient to analyze it. But as technology advanced, that evidence became valuable. That evidence became the key to solving a 20-year mystery. The case demonstrates several important lessons. First, physical evidence collected at crime scenes should be carefully preserved, even if current technology cannot analyze it effectively. Future technology may make that evidence valuable. Second, DNA evidence is extraordinarily powerful. A few skin cells under fingernails, barely visible, can identify a perpetrator decades after a crime. Third, serial killers often evade justice for extended periods, but technology and persistence can eventually catch even the most elusive predators. Fourth, victims sometimes leave evidence that survives long after they die. Caroline's fingernails, preserved after her death, carried the DNA of her killer, her struggle, her resistance, her scratches. These became the evidence that brought her killer to justice 20 years later. For Sandra and Robert Morrison, the conviction of Derek Sampson brought a form of closure. They finally knew what happened to their daughter. They finally knew who murdered her. They finally had justice, even if that justice came 20 years too late. Sandra Morrison established the Caroline Morrison Foundation in her daughter's memory. The foundation works to support victims of violent crime and to advocate for improvements in forensic investigation. "My daughter left evidence during her struggle," Sandra says in interviews about the foundation. Her scratches, her DNA under her fingernails, That evidence brought her killer to justice 20 years later. But that's 20 years of suffering for our family. 20 years of not knowing. 20 years of wondering. I don't want other families to have to wait that long. I want to advocate for funding in forensic labs, for improved DNA technology, for more resources devoted to cold cases. If we can solve cases faster, if we can identify killers sooner, we can prevent other families from enduring the suffering that we've endured. The Caroline Morrison Foundation has become a significant force in Australian criminal justice advocacy. The case of Caroline Morrison and Derek Sampson is ultimately a story about the power of resistance. Caroline Morrison was abducted, assaulted, and murdered. She was a victim of extraordinary violence. In her final moments, facing her killer, she was powerless to save her own life, but she was not powerless to help catch her killer. In her struggle against her attacker, in her resistance, Caroline scratched her killer's skin. She left DNA evidence. She left biological evidence that would sit dormant for 20 years, waiting for technology to catch up. When that technology finally arrived, when that evidence could finally be analyzed, it revealed the identity of her killer. Caroline's resistance, her struggle, her scratches, these brought Derek Sampson to justice 20 years after her death. In a profound way, Caroline Morrison had the final word. Her DNA, preserved under her fingernails for 2 decades, spoke truth. It identified her killer. It brought him to justice. The case demonstrates that even in the darkest circumstances, even in victims' final moments, there is agency. There is the power to leave evidence, to resist, to fight. Caroline Morrison did not know that her struggle would lead to her killer's conviction 20 years later. But it did. Her resistance mattered. Her evidence mattered. And her killer, who might have believed he was safe, who might have believed he had evaded justice, was ultimately identified and imprisoned. This is the story of Caroline Morrison, and the serial killer that her final act of resistance, preserved under her fingernails, finally brought to justice.